But there is one of my favorite books of all time, and it is a children's book that my kids both have memorized. And it's called What Do You Do with a Problem? And it's about this little boy, or it's actually just a little child. It could be a boy or a girl. And this child is facing this problem, and he tries avoiding it, and he tries running from it, and he tries hiding from it. And finally, he gets so sick of it, and it's just clouding his entire perception, that he finally has the courage to face it. And one of my favorite lines in the book is what he realizes is that problem was actually an opportunity. And it's an opportunity to learn and to grow and to be brave and to do something. That's the power in every problem. And when you can look at problems through that lens, it's no longer toxic positivity.
Kimberly, welcome to the Point of Impact. Glad to have you here.
I'm so honored to be here with you, Aaron. I think what you're doing in this world is such a testimony to possibility, and I love it.
Well, thank you very much. And it's funny too, because the challenges, as we all know, we both know, is that they're never ending. Yes. If life were easy, we're not trying hard enough, right? So, great example is the challenge every single day of just trying to find that record button and be able to hear you. But I've been looking forward to this conversation for a little while, and in researching your background and following your podcasts and all of that, I've been learning quite a bit. It's amazing what you're doing, but I guess my first question would have to be the taglines. Here you talk about stepping into your reign, sovereignty, crown yourself. Where does this communication queens? Where does this come from? Where does it stem from?
Well, they're pretty audacious taglines, aren't they? And names of companies. So, I mean, for me, I always dreamed, like I was the little girl who dreamed of being a princess, but I never liked or imagined or cared for the stories where like a girl just had to be kissed and then she would, wake up and suddenly be crowned queen. I was in the Disney era of Belle and the princesses that had to face some form of adversity, like the Little Mermaid getting legs, and turning human and having to make sacrifice and looking at what the cost of what they wanted was for who they could become on the other side. And when I was bought out of my e-commerce company in 2014, 3 weeks before I walked down the aisle to marry my husband, we jetted off to our honeymoon in Italy. And I was like, I don't know what I'm going to do when I get back. And we were looking at all of my passions growing up because I'd had a Pilates business, a brick and mortar. I'd been president of an e-commerce company. I'd fulfilled the childhood dream and become a screenwriter. And Lionsgate picked up this high-flying, hard-partying motocross movie called Bro that I co-wrote. Like, I had so many accomplishments, and there was no through line to the story. But a big through line that really came through was storytelling. And a big thing, a metaphor that I've always loved embodying was that archetype of the queen. And if you think about the archetype of the queen or the king or a sovereign, they are born into this world with an expectation that they are going to be leaders and not just like a leader of a small group. They're like the leader of a nation and of a country just by birthright. And I look at I'm a mom of two and with one on the way. And I look at how our kids are raised so often in society where their leadership ability is suddenly questioned. And it's something that, they're not being obedient. So that needs to be tapped down versus encouraging that. And I looked at this archetype of a sovereign, of a leader, of a king or a queen. And not only from the moment that they're born are they expected to lead a country, but they're being primed and trained for it. and they're being raised and they're being surrounded by mentors and leaders and guides to support them in learning how to make the best decisions and think through decision making. And so when I was there on my little Airbnb couch off the coast of Italy, I leaped off the couch and I said, "Crown yourself." And my husband goes, "What's that?" And I said, "That's the name of my company." And he said, "Great. What do you do?" I said, "I have no idea, but it's something like Marie Forleo." And I didn't know what to do. I was stuck in a space of fear and doubt because I just dealt with 3 months of dealing with lawyers who don't say the nicest things on the other side of an email when you're not paying them for your side. And suddenly, while always been very audacious with my career and with my dreams, I'd had challenges in other areas of life. I'd had challenges with relationships. I mean, the stories I could tell of the choices of men that I dated, it was atrocious. And the, and I had battled and overcome my body and hating my body and 10 years of bulimia and forgiving my father and dealing with growing up with an addict as a child. And throughout until I was 30, actually, my dad was still drinking. And the challenges of that. And I'd overcome all of these adversities, but never once had they touched my career. And in that was the one area of career, business, where I felt untouchable until I went through this buyout process. And that was when suddenly, even though something that is seen in the business world, seen as very successful, like I exited a company, I saw it as a failure. And it was all about my perspective of how I saw it. And because I saw it as a failure, I treated myself as a failure for a year and a half until I found out that I was pregnant with my first son and was like, well, this is not the version of me that I want to be to raise my child, because I know I'm in the business of raising both gentlemen and now soon a lady. But I'm in the business of raising leaders, and kids have always been my driving force. And I've always known that I was going to be a both. I was going to be a mom and a businesswoman. And looking at how I was being back then in 2016, I saw that I was stuck in a cycle of blame, shame, and comparison. And I knew it was a mindset shift. I knew I could make that mindset and perspective shift. I knew I had a 9-month deadline to do so. And so I got to work.
Well, I opened up a whole can with that first question, didn't I?
Yes.
There's so much there. By the way, where in Italy? Where were you?
We were in this little village called Monelia, which is about 5 train stops north of Cinque Terre. And Cinque Terre are those 5 coastal villages that like rise up from the sea in these beautiful colors. And when we were in Italy, we actually ate at what would then be named the world's best meal twice in this little tiny town. Gosh, I forget his name. But it was the restaurant was called a Sirto, and the owner would sit us down. There was probably like 8 tables, and he would sit us down and just explain the menu, explain where the ingredients came from. It was magical. Like the best place to start off a marriage ever. Like my husband and I had a wonderful time, and we really set the tone for how we wanted to live our life. And a lot of it involved travel. So when we got stuck in Australia, fast forward to 2020, and we decided to stay, we were like, well, we've done long-term travel before. So we ended up packing for a 2-week vacation that turned into 2 years and had a baby over there and came home.
My wife and I actually honeymooned in Florence. I used to live in Italy, so I'm quite familiar with that area. As I used to live in Naples, so I love the cuisine, the history, the culture, all of it. I was very, very familiar with that.
Florence, like that was the place that my husband, when he saw a Florentine steak on our honeymoon for the first time, it was in a piazza, and he looked at that steak the same way he looked at me in a wedding dress, and he literally had tears in his eyes. Because because he was so happy with the moment. He was just savoring all the juiciness of it. My husband's a chef, so he's like, I give him credit for that.
I tell you what, when you talk about the best meal, I remember going to a place outside of Naples, and it was the it was like half of a personal household, like a family household. They like a living room and a den. They put seats up, and it was a family serving food in their living room. But you just sat down and they started serving food, and all you ordered was the kind of wine. But they just brought out plate after plate of what they were making that day, and it was, I don't know, 8, 9, 10 different courses.
Oh my
And
gosh.
I don't even know the name of the place. We called it, this was back before the euro, but it was the 40 mil place, or 40 milione lira was all you paid. Maybe $20. And you got the most amazing meal. And you didn't have to even look at a menu. It's incredible. But I'm not hijacking this conversation.
You and I
It
could have a
just sparked
tangent on Italy all day.
oh my gosh. And don't get me started on Australia, because I love that place too. But you you had this transformation, and before we talk about the catalyst for the transformation and what that meant, what the process was, can we start with a little bit of the background? You mentioned a difficult childhood, your father. Can you expand a little bit more on that? I know you mentioned it in your TED talk.
Yeah, my first memory as a child was is the flashing lights of police and the colors of that from my dad flipping his pickup truck, like he had the giant, because he was an arborist, this giant truck that he drove, probably intoxicated at that time, and that he had flipped on the freeway. And that's my earliest childhood memory that I can recall. And looking back, like my TED talk was incredibly healing when I was able to, when I gave that, because it allowed me a lot of time to reflect on, because my dad passed in 2021 when we were over in Australia. I said goodbye to him on an iPad. My mom said goodbye to him on an iPad because it was, COVID restrictions and all that. And that experience allowed me to, and I was also pregnant at the time with my second son. And I didn't know it was a boy at the time. We were certain it was a girl. It was not. He was very clear he was not. But that experience of having a loved one, having a parent who you had a complex relationship with, I was very much in the savior role or the villain role of my dad's, in my dad's perception, where I would swoop in and save him. I would, for the past 5 years of his life, every year there was some medical emergency that I would race and take him to. And whether it was, getting him out of the psych ward in the VA because he decided to go off his meds and go cold turkey off of opioids at the same time. And that led him to suicidal ideations. And I think we're doing such a disservice to our vets, because the care that he received was abysmal. And we got him put into a rehab facility for opioid addiction in 2019. But or if it was, racing him to the hospital thinking he was having a stroke and he was actually just really, 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 really drunk. So drunk that that he was 3 times over the legal limit 6 hours after he had driven home, and we got him tested at the hospital. And those experiences, when I was in Australia and got to say goodbye to him, I realized the challenge of saying goodbye and grief and not having, like, fortunately, I've built up a repertoire of different tools, whether it's timeline therapy, hypnosis. I have a wonderful therapist who does EMDR. Whether it's biodynamic breath work and somatic trauma release. I've built up a repertoire of different ways to process through emotions and how things get stuck in the body. And so I had enough training and enough experience in releasing and leveraging all of these tools that I'd built up over the past decade. My dad didn't have those tools when his parents passed. And unfortunately, when his parents passed, that was the most challenging time in my childhood. To the outside, everything looked great. And that's why it's really hard when people see him. And he was actually a big YouTube star, which was really funny toward the end of his life. He was on a show called Elders React. And so many people were like, oh, he was my favorite grandpa. And I'm like, I can't watch those episodes because I know he was drunk. And he's so wild and gregarious and fun. And I'm like, no, that and both my mom and I have the same reaction. And it's kind of, like the only thing that I can equate it to is like that when you've been through an experience together and outsiders don't understand that experience. And so that was my growing up, was that behind closed doors, when my dad was drinking, he was not the nicest person to be around. And I always say that I grew up with 4 dads. I had the really amazing sober dad. Like, man, when he was sober, he was phenomenal. And one of the best money mindsets, the strongest faith you could ever have. But when he was drunk, he was an asshole and abusive. And that was incredibly challenging to hold this paradox. But it did allow me to see that I do have a skill set. And I think that now I truly deeply believe everything happens for us, not to us. And it took me a long time to get through that mentality, because growing up, I believed I was broken, damaged, and a victim, given some of the experiences that I went through with my dad. And it was through healing that, and healing my relationship with my own body, and through a 10-year battle with bulimia, that I realized, wow, it was never my dad shoving my finger down my throat. That was me. That was my choice. And I had to look at the choices that I had made, that I had been blaming him for a decade, that weren't him at all. They were me. And bisecting my identity from who I thought I needed to be for him into actually creating who I wanted to become. And especially as I grew up and then got married and became a mother, that bifurcation became even more clear. And there were just more layers that got stripped away, and still do. I mean, still that there are still belief systems that I bump up against too, around deserving or around feeling like a disappointment on a regular basis. I just recognize them, and I don't give them as much credence.
Do you attribute the bulimia, the self-image, directly to his alcoholism, his substance abuse, or was it maybe parallel, tangential to it?
It's a little bit of both, honestly, because for me, that was my modicum of control. And I could control what I put in my body, and I could control what I didn't put in my body. And I could control for a little bit, but control is such an illusion. And it was a fleeting resource and tool that I used for a decade. But after a while, I think when I was 16, I told my parents that I was struggling with it. And my mom was horrified. And my dad goes, "Oh, I sometimes do that too." And I was like, okay, not exactly the response I was going for. But after I had told my mom, I snuck upstairs to go to the bathroom after dinner, and she bounded up the stairs and sat on me, preventing me from throwing up in the toilet. And she said, "Kim, I love you too much to let you kill yourself." And that was when I realized that an eating disorder is a slow form of suicide, and I didn't want to die, but I also didn't really know how to live, and I didn't know how to live inside my body. And as I started to heal my relationship with my body, it brought up many body traumas that I didn't realize that I had suppressed and experienced, including being molested when I was a child by my father. And that experience, I am so grateful for now because, and I say that, and I know it sounds so freaking weird, but it's allowed me to actually save lives by sharing that story. And I literally shared that story in a crowded room in 2018 at a conference, and we were all supposed to share the hardest thing that we went through. And I said, yeah, forgiving my father for what he did to me when I was about 5, 6 years old. And this young kid finally admitted that he had been raped when he was 12. And he had the breakdown of breakdowns and a breakthrough. And I didn't realize until later. I had a gut feeling that there was something magical about that moment. And I called my dad because it was after, it was in 2018. So he'd been sober for a year and a half off of alcohol after I'd staged his intervention. And I said, Dad, I know you struggled with your own forgiveness. And he wanted me to share our story because he was also molested when he was a child. So it was a generational cycle. And it's highly likely my grandmother was as well. And I was like, I am the cycle breaker. It ends with me. And my response to him was, I said, I know you're struggling with forgiving yourself. I said, but I feel like in my gut that we just saved a life. And I said, so for whatever reason, I said, take it for what you will. But I just wanted to share that with you because I think that all things happen for the good, even the shit, even the suck. And later, after my dad had passed, I got to stay in touch with this gentleman and who had the breakthrough. And he said, Kim, you saved my life that day. And I said, I had a feeling I did. He said, no, Kim, I was literally planning my suicide for that night. He said, I had said a prayer that morning. I said, God, if nothing changes, then I'm going to take myself out into the blackness of the ocean. And I said, and I was stunned. And because I had known, but I didn't, like, my body knew before my brain did. And I knew that story of just being able to have the courage to share that could save a life. And it just speaks to the testament of how powerful it can be when we hear testimonies of possibility, when we hear that someone went through hell in their own way. And when I was preparing and building my TED Talk, that was the first time that I ever alluded to the experience that I had with my father when I was a child. And I said, Mom, I'm questioning sharing this. And she said, your dad would have wanted you to share it. Please do. And I said, okay. And no backlash, no backlash from any family members. I was quite surprised. But I told my dad in 2018, because he had said, I want you to share our story. And I said, I'm not going to do it while you're alive, because I know the labels and connotations and associations that come with that. And he was a good man who made a poor choice that was rooted in childhood trauma. And that takes a lot of forgiveness to say, but also I didn't want him living with the repercussions of, he was already beating himself up enough as it was. And rightly so. But at the same time, there comes a point where you also have to forgive yourself.
That begs another question. It's how much weight do you give other people's perceptions of you? I hear a lot of people saying break the stigma, right? But I also believe that what other people think about me is, well, none of my business. What
Yep.
I think about me is the most important thing. But there, we do live in a society. We have to interact with each other. We do business and there's commerce and raising a family with other neighborhoods, family members. So how much weight do you give other people's opinions and perceptions?
I live by a very simple principle that that which is conscious manifests happily, and that which is unconscious manifests unhappily. And I found this principle to be a very strong guiding light in looking at when something unhappy shows up in my experience. And I can give you a very crystal clear example because it just happened yesterday. And because I had a client say something in a private conversation that was a little demeaning. And I was like, why is this activating to me? And he said, oh, you're just, I get it. You're a mom with a side hustle. And I was like, excuse me? I have been in business for 17 years as an entrepreneur. This is my fourth business. Like I am in the top 15% of all entrepreneurs, especially as a woman making over six figures. Like, excuse me? But it activated me. And I had to really take a look at it. And I fortunately have surrounded myself with many friends who are not just yes women and who will guide me to like, is this an accurate perception? And one of my girlfriends sent me the back that I was like, does anything about my brand or my business kind of look or feel like a side hustle? Like, am I that mom who's sharing too much about how amazing her kids are? Like, and how cool her kids are? Because I love bringing my kids along for the journey. I mean, the fact that my son, my 3-year-old he's been shouting since my book came out, in September, on September 30th, he's been shouting, Mommy's book. And every time he sees it, he's like, it's Mommy's book. And it makes me so proud. And I'm happy, like I share that because I want to share that we are examples for the next generation. And yet, this comment from my client triggered me. And I was like, okay, well, let's look at this activation. Let's see, is this ultimately true? And my friend sent me back the best text. And she's like, is this free of projection? Is this free of intent? Like, what was the intention behind the conversation? And I looked at the intention. And I was like, oh, okay, I can understand why someone would say that. And then she's like, thirdly, and you have to bleep this out, but she was like, fuck that. And I said, I'm so grateful for being able to surround myself with people who will allow me to question and be in the space of questioning, because I will always look first as like, okay, how did I create this scenario? Why is this bothering me so much? Because if it's bothering me so much, then there's something in my own internal projection, in my own subconscious mind, that I get to work through and that I get to heal ultimately. And so I'm the type that I will look right through a projection if something comes into my awareness and really activates me. That's something that I'm like, okay, I'll examine this. And that was something that I was, and I worked this process continuously. Now, I remember when my dad was still alive and he said something very silly. Occasionally he would say some like stupid things about like, he would just make some really dumb comments about women. And I was like, and I remember one time he said it and I was like looking at my mom and I was like, you don't really believe that. And I could tell, I was like, that's something that you've learned. It's almost like hearing somebody speak poorly in another language. And you're like, that's not your native tongue. I know that's not your soul that's speaking. I know that's just your programming. And that was something where because it didn't impact me, because I was like, well, that's just dumb. Like, that's just a dumb comment. Like, it didn't activate me. And thus I knew that side of me had healed in that space. Now, there will be things that people can say. And I look at, what is worth protecting? And yeah, there's perception. And I think also there's a balance of like looking at authenticity. And so many people these days are so obsessed with protecting their brand image that they forget to be an authentic human being with showing the stuff that people are actually going through. And I actually think that pivot is happening drastically in the marketplace. I've seen it as a business owner where people and the FTC are looking at these gigantic claims and, oh, look at the highlight reel of my life and here's all the amazing things and look at how successful I am and here's my Lamborghini and all that. And people are seeing through the BS and they're like, okay, well, what did it take to get you there? Because yeah, you may have had this major success, but are you also talking about the 10 years of therapy, transformation, internal work that you've been doing in order to heal yourself to get to that place where you could have that lightning fast launch or that lightning fast transformation? And I see how these things in business also cross over into the personal realm as well.
After these messages, we'll be right back. I'd like to thank the sponsor of this episode, Extraordinary Delights, EODFudge.com. Extraordinary Delights is a disabled veteran, family-owned small business making handcrafted fudge and other sweet treats for the chocolate-loving patriots just like you. Go to EODFudge.com and check out some of our delicious flavors like triple threat chocolate with or without walnuts, mint dark chocolate, strawberry and creamy white chocolate, or my personal favorite, American Pick-Me-Up, an all-American version of tiramisu. While you're there, go to the apparel store and check out our awesome t-shirts, polos, and the baddest tactical apron on the market. You see me wear on the TikTok show, Aaron Hale's Cook Without Looking. So, right now, go over to EODFudge.com and pick out some fudge, other sweet treats for that patriot in your life with a sweet tooth. That's EODFudge.com. EODFudge.com. And now, back to the show. Well, tell me more about the personal journey of self-perception, not of others' perception of you, but what I'm getting at is a lot of times we put up these limiting beliefs. We don't even realize it.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's an aha moment. So we don't know what we don't know, sort of thing. We don't know that we're limiting ourselves in a certain way. So how did you start this transformation?
Well, I started it by getting myself into a different environment. They say you can't heal in the environment that made you sick. And when I was 19 years old, I was working in Hollywood, but I needed a bridge job. And so I went forward and I became a certified Pilates instructor. And that was my first business as a freelance Pilates instructor. And within 6 months, I'd made enough money to move out of my parents' home and got myself my own apartment. Getting that distance and having that space, my husband and I actually have put in place a policy with our kids is that in order to inherit anything, they're going to have to live for at least 1 to 2 years by themselves. No roommates, no girlfriends, no partners, just by themselves. Because I think that is a powerful learning experience when you learn to be by yourself and who you are when no one else is looking. And being in that space of being by myself, I got to, and then also simultaneously training and teaching mostly women, but a lot of men too, for 10 hours a day. I was being exposed to different belief systems, and our brain is wired to survive, not to thrive. And so I started hearing stories from other people. And this is why I love podcasts. This is why I love going on podcasts, because every single person's story has a power to unlock something within someone else, within someone who's listening, if you're just listening to learn. And the Pilates studio was my podcasting at the time because I didn't know about podcasts back then. So I was just listening to my clients' stories. And I started to see parallels and dichotomies and juxtapositions of behavior. Like, for example, one juxtaposition that I had was I had one client who was the most stressed out human I probably have still to this day that I know, that I've seen. Her stress literally was like in her body, stuck in her gut. And she was completely financially supported by her ex-husband. Her kids were grown up. Her kids drove Mercedes to their own school. Like they were very well supported, and she obsessed and had the most stress over napkins at the PTA meeting. Meanwhile, I also had a client who was a partner in a law firm. She in a huge law firm, a global one, and she was a mom of two kids with one on the way. She'd mosey in at like 9 o'clock at night for her Pilates lesson, and never did I feel stress from her body. She was like, oh, and anytime I'd ask her, like, well, don't you have more work to do? She's like, yeah, I'll probably run by through Starbucks on the way. And it was just, she made the stress no big deal. And I saw this belief system, and I was able to see juxtapose the belief system of purpose versus productivity. And so I started to question my own purpose, my own productivity. What are my own stories about stress? I started to question my own stories about relationships. And I mean, my clients back then, they saw me go through some rough relationships of choice, because I was so young, and also I was choosing men that allowed me to feel smart and allowed me to feel powerful. And I saw how the people that I was choosing were projections of all of this stuff that I had going on inside. And those experiences really shaped me into being the person who would be ready for my husband. And I'm so grateful for all of those, because I had the belief systems, and I saw how my belief systems were manifesting in the type of person that I was choosing. I mean, I was briefly married. I pulled a Brittany when I was 22, ran off, got married to a Navy man 2 weeks before he deployed. It was very romantic. But when I realized he's on the other side of the world and we're still screaming at each other over the phone, how in the world are we ever going to live in the same household? And I remember this moment, and I think that this is when we can listen to our soul speak of like, what the heck are you doing? And it was a moment when I had said, I really miss performing, because I'd been a performer. I'd been a screenwriter. I'd started my Pilates business. I had all of these various ambitions. And my ex-husband was on the other side of the world, and he goes, Kim, wait, so you want to be a Pilates instructor and a business owner and a screenwriter, and you want to perform, and you want to be a wife, and you want to be a mother? Like, how are you going to do it all? And I remember being like, oh my God, he doesn't even know me. He doesn't know me. And I also recognized, whose fault was that? And I said, that's my fault, because I had not been fully honest with who I was, with my ambitions. I had been the type that I would contort myself into whatever mold fit the person that I was interested in so that I would be loved. And that experience allowed me to realize, wow, I'd made a huge mistake. I'd contorted myself into this version that hid away her ambition in order to please her partner. And when he came back, we separated and eventually divorced. And fortunately, then a year later, I then said the prayer of complete surrender. And I said, God, all I want is, I just want to be authentic, and I want to travel. And this guy 2 hours later saunters up to me in a bar and goes, hi, I'm Spike. And I'm like, hi, I'm Kim. He goes, Kim, I got one question for you. I said, what's that? And he said, are you single? And I said, and at the time I was in this It's Complicated on-off relationship. And I said, I guess you could say I'm in It's Complicated. He said, great. At least I'm not barking up the wrong tree. Let's grab a drink. And my husband has been my experiment in honesty and in complete candor for 12 years. Because you know how they say you're not supposed to say all those things of, your past and unlock your baggage, and you don't dump your baggage out in the first meeting? Yeah, that wasn't me. I was like, okay, God, I had just prayed this prayer, and my husband was like the direct reflection of like, oh, we're going to test if you're ready for this. We're going to see if you're really ready to fully be authentic. Most of my friends at the time had thought that I'd only been engaged to my ex-husband because I was so ashamed of having run off, and so ashamed of like not had this, big dream fantasy. And I subdued that dream that I didn't tell anyone. And so I told him, I said, yeah, I've been married. And he was like, oh, what happened? And I shared that story, and I shared all these stories. And he's like, I really love how honest you are. I'd love to cook you dinner. A week later, I broke up with the guy officially that I was seeing. And then I went on my first date with my husband the next day. Within a month, I was like, he's done. That's it. But he wouldn't have been had I still been that former me. And I think that's the beautiful thing about every relationship. Every relationship has the power to be that mirror to the stuff you got to work through inside. I think kids are the best for this because, man, when I see some of my kids and what they do, I'm like, ooh, that's me. And sometimes I'm like, oh, that's me. So it's being able to, I think we heal. We are communal beings as humans. And when we can look at relationships as the great teachers to show us where they're our mirrors, they show us where's the limiting beliefs we still have. Where are those things that get us activated? Like that silly conversation with my client the other day. I was like, I got to examine a belief system that I didn't know was stuck still. And I'm so grateful for that experience.
The personality gymnastics, the contortion you have to do to uh, make make yourself into something you believe somebody else wants you to be, doesn't sound familiar at all.
And I mean, how egocentric is that too? Of like, hey, I know exactly what you want. I'm like, oh my gosh, if I tell that to my kids, they're like, no, mom, you don't. I want this. I want chocolate, not vanilla. So it's really looking at how our egos can do this dance to keep us in a belief system that we're safe in the stuck in the familiar, in the comfort zone, and in a space of what we believe we can control.
I've even had the deployment marriage. So, yeah, been there. Uh, but what you talked about, what you mentioned earlier about sharing your story, and I use this quote, and I still have no idea where I got it from, probably a meme on Facebook, but it says someday your story of struggle might be someone's blueprint for survival. And it's important to share because, like you said, having the podcast and listening to other people's stories, their mindsets, their perspectives, uh, it just widens the frame of our perspective. It opens up that window to different possibilities. Now, where along this journey did you become the leadership coach, um, and how is that affecting others? How is that making an impact in others' lives? How is it making an impact in yours?
Along the journey, I mean, I turned Crown Yourself into a coaching company in 2016 when I realized it was a mindset shift that needed to happen, when I realized I was pregnant, when I realized I had $40,000 worth of debt, and I still slapped $5,000 down to go get certified in NLP, timeline therapy, and hypnosis on a credit card because my gut and intuition was like, this is what you need. Oh, and by the way, it's in 2 weeks. You're going to be driving by yourself to Vegas to stay at a hotel that you can't afford so that you can just get this training. And I did that and it changed my life. And I'm so grateful for that experience and listening to that intuition and trusting that it would work out. Because I was in such a place of surrender that I was willing to receive, I was willing to heal. And so I started out with mindset, body, image, and wellness coaching. I then shifted into more mindset coaching and just doing breakthroughs. So I was doing breakthrough after breakthrough for clients. And then they were saying that they wanted to stay with me longer. And so I got certified in certified high performance coaching with the High Performance Institute. If you're familiar with Brendan Bouchard, I got certified through his program and got a framework for 12 weeks of high performance coaching. And so I started leveraging that. And then I started seeing from my years of business experience and growing different types of businesses and working with different leaders, I saw how this could be applicable to someone's business and I created my own Queen Bee curriculum that I now put my clients through as well, in addition to the high performance. So we're looking at the systems, the skill sets, the strategies, the marketing, and is your marketing congruent with who you actually want to become, with your level of performance, with who you're saying you want to be online? Is it really resonating with who you are at home when you're by yourself? And so I've just been able to accumulate these experiences of seeing my clients have radical transformation, whether it's just reconnecting with their estranged children, which that one brings tears to my eyes every time, because the fact, like, beyond the business success, like, for me, family is everything. And I think that I have worked with extraordinary leaders who have crappy relationships with their kids and with their spouses and with their families. And it breaks my heart, because then what is success? Like, who are you building it for if your kids don't even want to be around you? And the ability to see, like, one of my clients, I was able to, like, yes, we were able to help her hit her 1-year goals in 3 months. And another one of my clients was struggling with her child with doing some things with drugs that he shouldn't have been doing. But I was able to reframe it and say, wow, he sounds really entrepreneurial. Maybe college is not for him. Maybe he actually needs to learn how to leverage his sales skill set. And I gave the metaphor of Tom Bilyeu's company and Quest Nutrition, and what they built and what they saw with, hiring people who were, they were from the streets. And yet they knew, every drug dealer knew where all the competition was. And I said, he sounds really entrepreneurial. If we could just tailor that into being a positive. And she was able to recognize, this system that she was trying to get her child to fit in wasn't for him. He wasn't going to be the academic. He was going to be great at a trade school. And being able to have the conversations and have people start thinking out of the box that liberates them from thinking that they have to contort themselves to live inside a system that wasn't built for their success anyways.
That's taking a pragmatic approach to optimism, looking at the bright side of a situation. That's not to say the toxic positivity is just ignoring the reality.
Yes.
But you've got to find the positive side, the silver lining. And it's like nobody has an easy life. We mentioned it earlier. If you're too comfortable, if it's too easy, you're not trying hard enough. Everybody's life has difficulties, pain, trauma, and I think that's where some find excuses and some find reasons, right?
Mm-hmm. And I think the beautiful thing is, when you can, because one time I remember, I share the story in my book, Make Every Podcast Want You, of how there was a podcast that turned me down. And I rarely see because my team handles getting me booked on shows. I rarely see the turned down, but this was one particularly masochistic day that I was like, you know what, let's look at the list of rejections and why. And I remember one that stood out to me because they turned me down because I was too motivational. And I was like, what the heck? And I looked, and I went to this gentleman's website and I looked at it, and it was all about hard-hitting truths, and here's the 10 steps in a system, and there's, no hope, and there was no positivity, and there was nothing. And I was like, thank you for turning me down, because you saved me time, because I am the type that I will always find a silver lining, period, in any situation. In fact, I have a question that I ask my clients regularly. I asked my client this after her father passed away. And I always preface it where I say, look, I know you're going to want to punch me after I ask this question. Is this okay to ask this question of you? And Every time my clients will typically say yes. And I say, how is this the best thing that ever happened to you? And it's a hard one when you're staring at death and grief and pain and struggle and all of the stuff. But there is one of my favorite books of all time, and it is a children's book that I have, my kids both have memorized, not intentionally, but kind of intentionally. And it's called What Do You Do with a Problem? And it's about this little boy, or it's actually just a little child. It could be a boy or a girl. And this child is facing this problem and he tries avoiding it and he tries running from it and he tries hiding from it. And finally he gets so sick of it and it's just clouding his entire perception that he finally has the courage to face it. And one of my favorite lines in the book is what he realizes is that the problem was actually an opportunity, and it's an opportunity to learn and to grow and to be brave and to do something. And that's the power in every problem. And when you can look at problems through that lens, it's no longer toxic positivity. It's being able to acknowledge, like you said, Erin, like acknowledge that there is crap. There are all the isms of this world. There are all the challenges. There's all the stuff of this world that can really drag you down. But I would much rather look at it through the lens of hope, because there's also the law of polarity. And in polarity, darkness and light simultaneously exist. And it is a paradox. And it takes a lot of consciousness to be able to hold both, to hold a yes and framework. Yes, that crap is happening. And here's the good that can actually come from it. Here's what's happening. Like, here's how communities are coming together. Here's how people are banding together in support. Here's how love is shining through. These small examples, they're cracks and lights in the darkness that we wouldn't have appreciated had there not been darkness.
There's a difference between throwing your hands up and quitting, or assessing the situation and carrying on. We've got to take that realistic approach. And I'm a big fan of the sardonic humor. But, just like you mentioned that other podcast that turned you down, just being negative, it doesn't help your situation any. It creates a environment for excuses. So, you take stock of your reality, your skills, your abilities, and try to be solution oriented. Start being more creative with what you've got.
Yep. And it's being more resourceful.
Being resourceful, absolutely.
Yeah. And looking at, because when you really look at the resources that you have, you'll find that you have more than you realize. And I did a post on this recently, especially when I was promoting the book, and heavy in promotion. And I said, you'll never realize how deeply and wonderfully you're supported and the community that you've built until you start asking them for support. Because when you start asking, you'll be like, oh my gosh, I didn't realize these people would, no problem. Happy to support. How can I do anything else for you? Can I do, and it's amazing, but you have to make the ask first. Like, that's freaking biblical. Like, ask and it is given. And even Oprah, said, in life, you get what you have the courage to ask for. And I'm like, if it works for Jesus and it works for Oprah, I think that we can say, suffice it to say that asking might be a really good strategy. Asking for support, asking for new ideas, asking for solutions, asking for more resources. You have to ask and put those asks, whether into the universe, God, whatever it is that you believe, or into your community and into people, and trust that you're going to receive some form of a new and different answer back.
I think the fear of asking is with our lizard brains, where to ask is to risk, to show vulnerability and risk rejection. So we have to have the courage to step up and Um, you can't have vulnerability. We can't have courage without vulnerability. So, and you, like you said, you'd be surprised how many people will step up and answer, because generally speaking, we all want to help. Everybody, we're coded to help each other out. We want to do for others. You're absolutely right.
Yeah, I think it was a point that I said in my TED talk as a second point in decision making, but it really came from the experience of having people praise me for my strength when my father was in the hospital and eventually passed away. And oh, you're so strong. And I was like, I am not. Like, I did not feel strong at all. I felt weak and vulnerable and ripped open. And I think about it in terms of like the body. Like, we don't strengthen something that's already strong. Like, if something's already strong, we add more weight, we add more resistance to it because we have to break down those muscle fibers again to have them rebuild. So, looking at it from even just a biological perspective, like, weakness is actually a strength when you can admit, okay, when you're aware, okay, I'm weaker in this area and this is a space that I get to strengthen. This is something that I get to, and a lot of people don't like to admit where they're weak. I'm definitely one of them. For me, that was a belief system that weak meant danger. And so I always was very good on putting on a strong front and putting on a strong face. But it didn't serve, and it didn't serve my dad, because in his final days when he was struggling with pneumonia and COVID, he didn't admit that he was feeling weak or bad until it was too late. And those experiences of, really being able to check our ego and have the humility to say, yeah, look, I'm needing some support right now, and reaching out for that support, you will find it in droves. You will find people who desperately want to come and support and help, and who will raise their hand, who will message you. You just have to have that moment of vulnerability. And a lot of times it's in our minds. It's not even a reality. Like, when you actually experience the reality of putting yourself out there and asking for support, the illusion that you either won't receive it, or the illusion that people may think that you're weak because you're asking for it, it's it's just what it is. It's an illusion of fear and of your own ego.
We mentioned being on podcasts a few times now. Tell me a little bit about the book.
So the book, Make Every Podcast Want You, How to Become So Radically Interesting You'll Barely Keep from Interviewing Yourself. I'm so proud. I was just in New York. It was named as one of the top books of 2024 to change your life, because yeah, I teach you podcast strategy and how to get on podcasts and how to share your story and how to pitch effectively. I've been on over 250, probably up to upwards of 300 podcast interviews by now, let alone having my own two podcasts, the Crown Yourself podcast and the Communication Queen podcast, and having done tons of interviews over the past 5 years. But being able to put yourself out there to share your story, there is a vulnerability that comes with that. There, to circle back to that point of asking for the visibility, and asking for the spotlight, and asking to be seen, and asking for somebody to put you on their show, because your story as it is right now is enough to serve someone. Your story is that life raft for somebody. So being able to put yourself out there, I think that there is, and I give communication strategy, and here's what, the top percentage podcasts are looking for, of, the top 0.5 Ed Milet podcasts and all that. And then here's also, like, you don't have to go on the big giant podcasts that have hundreds of thousands of downloads per episode to make an impact. Like, I've had people drop me DMs from tiny little podcasts that I've been on, that, because their audience is so small, the audience is a tight knit community of support. And we're so happy that I delivered value and could serve. And it comes from that heart of service and being of service and putting yourself out there to let your story be heard, because it does have that ability to save a life. And it does have the ability also to grow your business. Because in sharing my story, in going on podcasts, we generated over $250,000 in new business revenue for my coaching business. My clients constantly have gotten referrals, clients from podcast interviews. But beyond that, there is a vulnerability that comes when you start sharing your story. And it was one of the feedbacks when we started our agency that I wasn't expecting. I've seen it in coaching, but when we started our agency, I'm like, these are pros that we're working with. These are people that are going on, speaking their truth. They're, they've got followers, they've built successful businesses. And yet still, I had one of our clients give me the best compliment. And she said, Kim, I still will go back before every podcast interview and I read my bio and I remind myself of how badass I am and what I've already accomplished. Because especially with high achievers, we can easily skip to scaling the next Everest and be like, oh yeah, I did Everest once. Like it was fine. And like jump to that next one, versus really allowing that achievement to be embodied, allowing that to ingrain, because yes, we are always going to be hungry for that next Everest that we get to scale. And we also need to give ourselves the credit that we did it in the first place.
Nice trick, by the way, in the Denver airport of slapping some free books on the bookshelves. That's some true guerrilla marketing right there.
Yes, if you want guerrilla marketing, that's my jam. I'm like, let's do it the underdog style.
You got an empty spot here. Can I put my own book up? Can't sell it. I don't care.
That's fine.
Fantastic. Oh.
And it started with an ask. I just went up, I saw the empty bookshelf and I was like, it's right up front. That's prime book real estate. Asked the manager, who literally was dressed like Wonder Woman. And I was like, Wonder Woman, you are literally going to save the day. Like, I'm going to help you, Wonder Woman to Wonder Woman. I'm going to save you filling up that shelf spot. And she was like, great, can't sell the book, but all good. And
can we help you stock those shelves?
Can I help you stock those shelves and surprise and delight your customers with, by the time they come to, oh, I want to buy this, they end up getting it for free.
Wow, that's a great method. Great move. Well, I really appreciate you coming on, sharing your vulnerability, your story, highs and lows, and your first perspective. I'd like to go into the final segment, which is the countdown to impact. This is 3, 2, 1. 3 books, 2 quotes, and 1 person that have all had an impact in your life.
So 3 books: 15 Commitments of Conscious Leadership by the Conscious Leadership Group, and Yes to Life by Viktor Frankl. I actually prefer Yes to Life to Man's Search for Meaning. Everyone knows Man's Search for Meaning. But Yes to Life, he actually wrote 9 months after he'd gotten out of the concentration camp. And it's filled with so much more vulnerability and rawness. And the third book, ooh, that's a tough one. Only giving me 3. I'm going to say a recent one, because it was Life's Golden Ticket by Brendon Burchard. And I recently found it and I didn't realize that it was my dad's copy. And he read it in 2018. And that was the best year that I had with my dad. And I found his notes scribbled in it and his agreements in, like, the whole book is on the premise of like this guy thinks he loses his fiance to a car accident. He tries to figure out what's going on, and stumbles upon this magical carnival, and he has to sign these 4 agreements before entering. And my dad checked off each box, and I got to read his note, and I sent a letter to Brendon thanking him, because I said, I think your book actually is a work of fiction. I do think fiction has the power to transform lives. And I think personal development is great, but I think sometimes our minds can learn better through story and through fictionalized story. And that was just a magical experience this year for me in reading that book. Two quotes. One would be from Viktor Frankl in Life. We have I'm going to butcher it, but I'm paraphrasing it. The greatest freedom in life is basically the power to choose. And it's the last, he called it the last of human freedoms, is the ability to choose one state in any given point in time. And it's that between the stimulus and response, that quote, that always has stuck with me. And then probably the second quote is one that's tattooed on my arm. It was from me when I was 4 years old. I found a video and I was like this audacious 4-year-old who just like, man, I saw her energy. I found this home movie when we were clearing out my childhood home. And my mom was asking me, she's like, Kim, how are you going to run through it? How are you going to get through the water forest? And I turned to her and I have like my hands on my hips and my little pink bikini. And I'm like, simple. You just run through it. And just ran through it and laughed and had a blast. And it was no big deal. And I got that tattooed on my arm this past year in January, because I was like, that audacity, that child who just had like the simplest of solution. You just run through it. You go straight through the fear. You go straight through the problem and you get out on the other side and you have a blast, laugh and giggle your way through. And because none of us are getting out of this life alive. So we might as well have a good time going through and just run through and look at each problem as an opportunity. So just run through it. That's the second quote. And then one person, I would say, I mean, I could list each one of my children and my husband for sure, my parents for sure. But I'm going to say actually the biggest one that's causing the greatest amount of change in me right now is my daughter that I'm still pregnant with. She is my initiation. She is causing me to assess my relationship with my mother right now. I've been so used to this identity of being a boy mom and, watching my kids just get dirty and run about and do all the, and punch each other and have to deal with, and you get to deal with that. But the difference of raising a girl and knowing everything that I've been through and knowing everything that I've experienced and no parent wants their child to experience, and be that responsibility of raising a girl now, it is weighing heavily on my soul, and I'm allowing myself to be to alchemize the next level of me. And so I'm really grateful to my daughter.
Girls scare me.
We're terrifying.
I've got 3 boys, and they're easy. You just throw food or a ball at them, and eventually they're going to fight over it. But it's like you need sleep, you need food, you need exercise, you need distraction, whatever it is.
Yeah.
Boys are, I think, simple.
Very simple. Yes.
Which is telling. But girls, they're dramatic, and especially little girls. They're cute. I mean, don't get me wrong. Also, on the flip side of that coin, I've always wondered and kind of lament not having a daughter because girls are daddy's girls, where boys are mama's boys. Because every time one of them skins their knee or something, I want mommy. Like, come on,
yep.
I'm right here. Anyways, going back to the books real quick, you mentioned it was the 15 Commitments of Conscious Leadership, and I mention that book all the time, and so many people haven't even heard of it. It's fantastic. So yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. We're going to put that up on the show notes. However, I think we've run short on time, and I want to take this opportunity to thank you one more time. If somebody wants to learn more, connect with you, where do they go?
If you love this episode and you want to hear more conversations like this, then head on over to the Crown Yourself podcast at crownyourself.com/podcast. And to grab the book, make sure you go to makeeverypodcastwantyou.com.
Awesome. We'll get that into the show notes. And thank you very much for speaking with us, Kim.
Thank you so much for having me, Aaron. It's been a pleasure.